Hey darts fans, that's Timo Newman here, the transporter. Welcome to the Good Ship Undarted Waters. And here we are on this voyage, the philosophy and strategy of improving performance. And this, I think, is video 5 in this series. I think this will be the last but one. We'll do a wrap-up video for the final video. But this is our third video in this series where we're learning from nature, learning from biology, how to optimize, how to improve. So we've done 2 videos on this topic already. The first one was all about mutations, how bacteria optimize basically. And then yesterday's video was about sexual reproduction, how we can use colliding 2 genotypes together, in other words, mixing up 2 throws together to innovate and to use those new innovative genotypes to then optimize and get to entirely new places in what we call the accuracy landscape, this 11-dimensional space that we have created in this darts series. So, really important topic today, whiteboard. You can't talk about optimization in biology. That's a nice little ton on the bull there. You can't talk about optimization in biology without talking about, of course, evolution. And we've been kind of touching on evolution a bit, but the thing is we haven't really been getting into the nitty-gritty of evolution. And why is that? Because we have always talked about a fitness landscape or our accuracy landscape like this. Okay, and if you're talking about biology, you would call this fitness, and if you're talking about darts, we call it accuracy. I'll just move this away from the board there, and I just turned the light off too. I forgot to do that. There we go, that's better. But we've been imagining that this shape, this landscape is fixed, but it's not fixed. This is kind of the rub. Why isn't it fixed? It's because in biology, the environment that organisms are trying to sort of optimize themselves in is always changing. So you've got a moving target, if you like. And what is that environment? Well, it's both the physical world around them, but it's also the biological world around them. If you think of a tree in a forest, its environment is the earth that it sits in, the high winds that it has to endure and so on, but it's also the other trees around it that it's competing with. It's also the kind of fungal organisms in the soil that either attack it or help it, depending on what kind of fungi they are. Okay, it's maybe the insects that help to pollinate it. Hence my little sketch there of some bees and flowers. So the environment that an organism has to optimize itself in is always changing, and it's very complex because it's actually got an environment which is other organisms that are also trying to improve. So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the most beautiful example of this, or one of the most beautiful examples, which is pollinating insects and flowers, all right, which was a massive innovation in the plant world. I don't know how long ago that would have been in evolutionary terms. I don't know. I would imagine it's something like 100 to 200 million years ago, but it might be even a bit more than that actually. But it's an example of what biologists call co-evolution, and I think this is really relevant to us because what's the connection with darts? It's what I kind of hinted at yesterday. We can talk about our throw, we can optimize our throw, but we are interacting with these, let's call them organisms, these darts, because these darts also change in the sense that the darts that we can use have a big dimensional space. The flights, the stems, the barrels, the points, the decoration on the barrel, the weight of it. So that's got a high dimensional space of its own, and manufacturers and technologists are constantly innovating these things. So our environment in terms of the equipment is changing quite rapidly. And this is a perfect example then of the time scale of our adaptation of our throw and the time scale of darts changing. And I want to make an analogy between that and the co-evolution, the co-adaptation between, say, bumblebees and flowers. So let's just talk about nature for a couple of minutes and then we'll bring it back to darts. So let me just do, let me just use this picture here. So here's a fitness peak. And let's say that we're looking at some kind of pollinating insect, like some kind of bumblebee, and it's doing very well. It's got a pretty high fitness, and it's gently holding itself to the peak of that fitness landscape. But at the same time, this is a codependency because the bees get food from the flower, they get nectar, and they also get pollen, which is a great source of protein. And you know that bumblebees have those pollen baskets on their hind legs that they carry pollen back to the hive. But the flower basically exploits the hunger of the bee to use the bee as a pollinator. So as the bee takes pollen off a flower and goes to another flower, some of that pollen will rub off on what's called the anthers of that other flower and fertilize the the ova of that flower. Okay, so the bee gets food and the flower gets basically sexual reproduction, basically, because obviously flowers can't move around to engage in sexual reproduction. They require an intermediary, namely pollinators. So let's imagine then that this bee species is doing pretty well and it's basically utilizing some form of flower, and that's the fitness landscape. But let's say over time that flower starts to diversify. So maybe it's undergoing some kind of speciation. So this fitness landscape then may start to look like this. And then it may actually, over time, look like that. And here's a question now. So this bee species is now, at this stage in the evolution of the flower, kind of got maybe two choices, but it can kind of flip between the two, you know. And then this is not an individual bee. This is a species over, say, thousands of years adapting, can basically sort of use both flower types probably, okay. In ecological terms, this would be called a niche, excuse me, a niche. And this is still kind of a niche. But as the flowers diversify, so the flowers themselves, the plants are forming their own individual niches, they might become separate species now. So you've now got two species of flower that have arisen from this original one species. And the question is, what does that species of bee do? Does it basically say, well, I'm going to stick to the right-hand side? I mean, of course, it doesn't say I, but I mean, we can personify it. So the mutations that take place in that species mean that it kind of just tracks the left-hand peak. There might be other ones of those species, though, that for whatever reason track the right-hand peak. So what can happen is that the speciation of the flower into two has actually driven a speciation of the bees into two different species of bees. And these would be, this species has co-evolved with this flower, and this species has co-evolved with that new flower species. And they are specialists. They're not interested in trying to do it all. They know what they like, and they are specialists. Okay? On the other hand, there might be a third bee species that arose from the original one that actually is happy to just basically sample both flowers, and that would be a generalist. So essentially a new, in the kind of the bee space, a new fitness peak has arisen that you can be quite fit if you are a generalist. You just sample both. Okay. And you can see that this is a very complicated process because all of these outcomes are possible. If another outcome that's possible is that if this separation goes quite quickly and this population does not adapt very quickly, then actually the final possibility is this, which is kind of like this, basically, for the bees. Right? So the fourth possibility is that the bees just can't adapt quickly enough and they go extinct. So they're basically left in what was a peak is now a valley and they're lost. So you can become a specialist, you can become a generalist, or you can go extinct. Eek. So that's nature, that's coevolution. So let's now think about this in terms of the darts, all right? I want to take these pictures away, I think, because they're not. I think the metaphor here is not exact, but it motivates us to think. So if I think about myself, you know, I'd say I'm sort of here. Let's say I'm here in my own kind of accuracy space, and I'd like to think that one day I'll get to this higher peak. But my landscape doesn't change, and the reason my landscape doesn't change is that on my darting journey, which is coming up to 2 years now, I've always used the same darts basically, except for the very first few weeks. I got some beginner's darts with a dartboard essentially, but then as soon as I got sort of really interested, I went and got some tungsten darts, and these are 21 gram Winmore sniper darts with the Winmore, the basic stems and flights. So nothing fancy, to be honest. So these, you know, the flights and the stems are like a pound a pack kind of thing, and the darts were about 40 odd pounds. And I went to a shop, and the owner was a very, very nice gentleman. He let me try out some different darts for about 10 minutes on the board there. You get 10 minutes in that shop. And he gave me different weights, and even though I was kind of a beginner still, I just thought, well, these ones are okay, 21 gram, and I just bought them, and I've never changed. So I'm sort of basically a specialist. That I've specialized myself to these darts, and I think I've avoided that skull and crossbones. I've managed to adapt to these darts, and therefore I'm sort of on some peak somewhere, but it's not a very high peak, obviously. So that's my story. But another player might say, well, my way of getting to this higher accuracy is actually not to change my throw too much, but to actually change the landscape. And it might be there's another landscape which would be different. Changing the darts would give you something like this, maybe. Okay, and what you can see then is that that throw, which was on a peak, that genotype, is now here, and you can hone it to a much better place. So by changing the landscape, by changing the darts, you change your accuracy peaks around you, and you don't even have to move at first. Your throw, by chance, can be very well suited, and you can climb. The danger, though, is that there's no guarantee of this. So it might be that a different set of darts would give you a fitness landscape like this, maybe. Okay, and that same throw that you have is now far worse. And when you hone it, you're just going to get to here, and your game actually just goes down. So I guess, you know, philosophically, I don't know whether it's my upbringing or whatever. You know, I grew up in quite a financially challenged household, and the philosophy was very much to make do with things. And you know, my dad used to say, a good workman never blames his tools, and all his tools were very old but tried and tested. So I think probably it's just my upbringing, my psychology, is that I'd probably just feel bad buying more stuff until I absolutely knew, I was 100% certain that I would never get any better with these. But I sort of feel like there's another peak in the landscape of these darts, okay? But I'm not saying that that's the best strategy though, it's just a strategy. So I'm one of the bee species that just tracked one of those new flower species. I'm not a great innovator where there's a whole new bee species that is a generalist and can sample many different, many different species of flowering plant. Okay, I mean, back in nature, sort of the advantage of being a specialist is maybe that you and the pollinator and the flower get so specialized to each other that nothing else can pollinate the flower, and therefore it actually adapts itself to that particular pollinator. And you see that sometimes in, I think, in the tropics, that there are flowers that actually mimic the precise shape of that insect, and so they have pseudo mating events. The insect thinks it's actually a mate, and by attempting to mate with the flower it gathers the pollen. So they're really, really specialized to each other. On the other hand, say in this country we have 12 species of bumblebee in the UK, and I think they're all probably quite generalist. I'm sure some of them will have certain preferences. They've found their niches within the flowering plants, but they are competing with each other. So the risk of being a generalist is that you're competing with lots of other generalists. All right. I don't know how far to carry that metaphor back to darts because I'm not a generalist. So maybe in the comments section, for folks who are generalists in the coevolution language, namely that they like to co-adapt their play by mixing it up with their equipment, so they've really got a fast timescale coevolution going on. Maybe they can tell us in the comments what they think the advantages and the pitfalls of that are. Okay. Just before I end this video, maybe just one thing I'd like to say is that music is a huge part of my life, and in my family's life we have a lot of music going on. I'm only an amateur musician, but I do love playing the piano, and I think a lot of my philosophy that I brought to learning darts probably comes from learning to play the piano over many decades. And if you're a pianist, you don't get to change your equipment very much, because the keyboard is the keyboard is the keyboard, and depending on what size hands you have, you just have to put up with it. If you have big fingers, it can be difficult. If you have small hands, it can be difficult. But you see professional pianists with every size of hand. You have petite ladies playing the piano and huge guys playing the piano, and they can be playing equally well. So humans are really good at adapting to fixed environment, to fixed equipment. And I wanted to mention the piano because two of the most famous pianists of the 20th century were Glenn Gould from Canada and Sviatoslav Richter from Russia. And they probably would be on anyone's top 5 list of pianists of the 20th century. The reason I mention them is that they kind of one of them was a specialist and one of them was a generalist in terms of pianos. So Glenn Gould was famous that he would only play one piano. He had his Steinway pretty much his whole professional life, and he would only play on that one piano, and it went all around the world with him when he toured. And if anything had happened to that piano, I don't know what he would have done. I mean, he was absolutely committed to that piano. So that's kind of like, I'm like the Glenn Gould, although I'm like a Glenn Gould wannabe in that sense, okay. Sviatoslav Richter was the opposite. In his autobiography, he says that when he went to venues, when he was very famous and he'd go to some venue to play a big concert, they would offer him 10 different grand pianos to choose from for the concert the next day. And he would try them out and choose one, but he said he hated doing that because it always made him feel that there was more pressure on him, that he'd chosen a piano, the concert would have to be extra good somehow, and it was more pressure. And he said what he preferred was actually just turning up and just playing whatever piano they had. So he loved actually going to villages, sort of incognito, and just giving a concert in a village to an audience for free and just playing on the village piano. He was kind of an amazing character, Richter. So he'd be like someone that kind of goes to a pub and just picks up whatever darts are around and just will play with those, will never carry their own darts with them. So he's like the other extreme, the extreme generalist. So I think, you know, we can only scratch the surface of this topic today with coevolution and co-adaptation, but I think it's fundamental to our game. So it might be that we have just a whole new series in the future that talks in more detail about at what stage in a player's development do they change equipment, and then how often thereafter should they change equipment. You know, is there like, does it depend on individual to individual, or is there some kind of perfect kind of rate to do that? You know, definitely though, I think what we can say is that you always need to be at the top of your local peak before you consider changing the environment. You have to sort of feel like I'm saturated. I can't do any more with this environment. I'm either going to have to innovate, you know, basically reproduce my genotype throws, or I'm going to have to change the landscape, get some new darting equipment. So does change come from inside or from outside? That's kind of the philosophy ultimately. You know, is the solution within us, or is the solution outside? So thank you so much, everyone. I've had some brilliant comments on this series, really interesting, and I've tried to, you know, do justice to those. The comments section is a place of a lot of interesting discussion, so I'm really grateful to people that take the time to share their experiences. So with that, we get 3 darts at the Oki, make them count, and we'll finish off this series in the final video, hopefully tomorrow. All the best.